Today on the DDK podcast, I'm going to talk about aiming. Now, for those of you that know me, you know that I work at AimLab right now, so this might sound like I'm just trying to shill, but that is not the case at all. As you know, and you'll find that out as we start to talk about this. I feel as someone that was a professional level Quake player and have been able to jump back into that level as is necessary, and I can get my aim back up pretty quickly. I felt for a long time I didn't really need to think about this area too much or really work on it. I'm always experimenting and trying to figure out new things to learn in this regard, new techniques, learn new shapes, sensitivities, messing around with my mechanics, challenging what I know just for fun. But in terms of the actual approach to aim training, that wasn't something I revolutionized until somewhat recently when I actually first did the AimLab Skills Challenge broadcast, where I was actually looking and immersing myself in the aiming communities and seeing what they had to offer. These guys are nuts. Considering how insane their mouse control is, it's pretty crazy that some of them are just dedicated like AimLab players. It's like that's all they'll play, aim trainer players. And they don't actually use these insane mechanics that they develop in anything that's competitive necessarily, which is quite fascinating. But either way, it is interesting because they have lessons for us to learn because we don't spend all of our time. I mean, just think of it this way. It's like, have you ever seen that? There's that old, I don't know if it's like a meme or how you would describe it. There's this image that was circulated, which is, or it's like a circle where like all of mankind's knowledge, and then there would be like a little kind of, you zoom into like one bit of the circle, and there's like this little kind of bump, and it said that's like what a PhD is, right? Pushing the boundaries of our knowledge. And that's how I'm looking at the aiming community. I'm thinking these people are so focused on pushing the boundaries here, and they are using methods that I don't think a lot of players would go to, and there's a reason for that. One of the big reasons is because of this idea that we understand is pretty provable, and that is the brain improves with specificity. It's very important. It's a very important component of how the brain gets better at stuff. You have to get better at stuff by doing the thing that you're trying to get better at. You can't do another thing and then be like, I'm going to be better at this thing that I didn't actually put any time into. That's not how it works, unfortunately. And using an analogy to illustrate this a little bit and then bringing that back to aiming, for those of you that have been on my podcast before, you probably heard me talking about this analogy a bunch of times, but I feel like it's pretty good at illustrating the point. In terms of getting stronger, we have two major components. There is the raw capacity, work capacity in the muscle fibers, and then there is the ability for your central nervous system to have the practice to know what fibers do I have to fire off, do I have to contract, and in what order to perform a certain movement pattern, right? So there's the raw capacity, and then there's the ability of just training your brain, training your central nervous system to do the specific thing. And we know that a sprinter can go into the gym and they can improve their work capacity. They can slap on much, denser muscle fibers and improve the overall capacity. But at the same time, you still need that practice element to tie it all together. Is it the case that that works at the same way? Well, I don't think we can improve our work capacity in that same way. But what I do think we can do is we can pick up techniques that we can then use in our practice in the game when we're applying that specificity. So for example, if you play six shot, what we're doing is this is a very applicable mouse control movement or series of movements that is used constantly when we're looking at tactical FPS games that require precision aiming. It's used constantly. So if you practice this a lot in isolation in AimLab, this is like what I found is like great improvements in my game, because in Quake, we don't aim like this. In Quake, you have to just hit upon, it's like first bullet accuracy. There's none of this flick, have I hit the target, micro correction business. We don't need that level of precision most of the time. And even if we did, our targets are dodging in such a way that we are needing to flick on them just straight away. I don't want to get into the whole like description of how dodging works, but in Quake games, but let's just put it this way. You're looking for your moment to just flick and just hit the target. So there's as least time as possible for them to actually mess you up. I'll leave it there. So what I have found in sort of revolutionizing my aim training is that by looking and isolating the kinds of mouse control movements and techniques, and then just figuring out what those are in AimLab and just going and doing them, that's been extremely helpful. And then I realized after doing this that I used to do this in Quake. It's just that I had to be much more creative and things were much more limited. It would be the case I would find out that I would have issues in smoothness because I'd have a higher sensitivity, issues in smoothness, or what I like to also call speed matching. So when you're tracking, gluing the crosshair to the target at the speed that it's moving, because it'll be a consistent speed. It's just that the speed changes based on distance, the distance that the enemy is away from you. If they're really close to you, they move very quickly. If they're very far away from you, they move very slowly. And certain distances were much harder for me. So I used to try to practice those in isolation. I would go to Clan Arena servers and play specific positions. So I would have a specific distance that my opponent would be, so I could practice getting the feeling down. And that sorted it out for me, just doing that practice. And what I've realized is that you can do this with pretty much everything. You just have to define what the skill sets are and the techniques, and you can find improvements. Now, one thing I'll recommend actually to kind of see what this could look like, some of these movements split up from one another in an aim trainer, go to events in AimLab and just play the Voltaic benchmark. And this uses the aiming community's metrics, which what they do is they split up aiming into 3 categories, and then they have 2 subsets from those. So they'll have clicking, or flicking, I think is a more of an intuitive term, but clicking. And then they'll have static and dynamic, so targets that are not moving and then targets that are moving. Then they'll have tracking, so they'll have evasive and reactive, so a target where it's just pure reactions, and then one where the target's kind of evading. And then you'll have the switching. So switching is a combination of flicking and tracking. And then you'll have flicking speed, where the targets have low time to kill. And then you have flicking precision, I guess. I think it's precision, where the targets are going to have higher time to kill. So there's more tracking action. So you get to see like these mouse control techniques kind of split up in these challenges. Now these challenges are quite difficult. And the difficulty actually exists within the fact that it requires you to use multiple skills at once, multiple techniques at once. But it's interesting. It's an interesting experiment because you'll see stuff that's just movements that will feel very foreign indeed. But any movement that you practice, you'll get better at over time. And this is the same again for your in-game. So the question is, how do I take from the aim trainer and put it into the in-game? Well, the question is, you can't one for one. But what you can do is you can take the techniques and you can work on the techniques, and then you can go in-game and then get the specificity of using that technique, applying that technique in the context it would be used in the game. So that's how I would look at it for those of you looking to do your aim training. And what I would look to do is make sure that when you're approaching your training, if you have a huge emphasis on aim training, then I wouldn't recommend that you do more than an hour in a day. But I think an hour is going to be sufficient for most people. You'll be able to cover most techniques. But if you're trying to improve it as a player at the same time, you might be wasting time doing that, because you can get warm and do some technique practice within 30 minutes. So you would otherwise be kind of robbing yourself of improving at playing the actual game. Now, again, it depends on you as a player, and I recommend approaching things in different degrees. So, for example, you may have it so that sometimes it's actually good to take a break from playing completely. You can have what I like to call like a pattern break. So I kind of look at this almost like a deload that lifters would have in recovery, where you're not trying to improve your strength or anything like that. You're just trying to work for recovery. So I'm not trying to improve my ability to play the game. I'm trying to allow my brain to take a rest from patterns that I've been habituating in my play. Because what happens is, if you over-habituate and over-routine yourself, let's say, it's a poor way to put it, but you understand what I mean. What can tend to happen is that then you'll be stuck in habits and you won't be able to as easily read the game and break yourself out of habits. Because what happens when you fall into a habit is you take certain things for granted and which means you stop taking in all of the information. So you might not have all of the info now to make a play that's actually quite creative. You would just skip over, you gloss over that piece of information possibly because you're very set in some of the assumptions that you've made for your play. So having a break every so often can help to kind of break that up and to allow you to not just do the same things and make the same mistakes over and over again. Another thing that you would want to do in that regard too is review yourself. And I know that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily have the best time with, but self-review is really important. And I think it's something that, you should fit in at least an hour a week would be enough. And there is this idea of fractals. So fractal is effectively in like mathematics, it's basically a repeating pattern. So you can have, you could have, so the idea here would be that you could look at like a minute of yourself playing the game, and there might be an issue there that actually perpetuates in everything that you do. So you don't need to study 10 hours of yourself playing to see a mistake. You can see that mistake that is, in 1 minute of your play, you can see some of these mistakes. And so you don't need to necessarily study yourself to that extent. Doing at least a little bit will help you to see some of the patterns or consistent errors that you might be making that you'll be able to be honest about. Because if you allow errors to get too deeply ingrained because you never challenge them and you never see them, it is a hell of a problem to dig them out later on. So I would advise doing that. And you can also, by the way, see issues in your aiming, because sometimes players will mistakenly think that they're making their aiming or mechanics are off, but in reality they're just putting themselves in poor positioning, and the other player is having an equal aiming performance but is operating from better positions. And then what happens sometimes is your aim will suffer because you start to emotionally suffer. Your confidence starts to go down in the game because you're putting yourself in bad spots, maybe not knowing that you're doing it. Or maybe you're in a game where you don't have many good spots, which happens sometimes. And because you don't even know how to get yourself into good spots in the first place, you're going to be kind of struggling. So there's a lot more to aim than meets the eye, but I wanted to make this podcast just to actually talk a little bit about aim in general and just how you can maybe start to think about maybe using aim trainers, because this is effectively a new technology that people are learning how to use. And I don't think many people have tapped into this very well. I think that there's an enormous degree of value from aim trainers. I think if you jump into AimLab and you find the techniques that you use most commonly in the games that you play, or find the techniques that you don't commonly use but come up enough that you aren't good enough at them, you don't get enough repetition, but it still happens enough that you're losing out edges by not developing those techniques, go and track those down in AimLab. Every single way that you move the mouse in the game, whether you're holding an angle and then slowly doing like micro tracking after, whether you're doing a big flick and then a micro correction, whether you're doing vertical tracking and aiming, are you moving the mouse in an arc? Are you, what kind of movements are you doing? Because for every person, the technique you're using to hold or grip on the mouse, the amount of dominance that you have between wrist, fingertips, and arm, all of these things are different for people. The friction that you have, the static friction versus the dynamic friction is different on your pads. So you're going to find different challenges within different techniques and in different moments, in different demands of the game. So pay attention to what those are. You can train those things. And if you get a sense, if you get a feeling for those things through repetition and isolation, it's going to help a lot. And that's actually part of the reason why these trainers are so good. It's because in AimLab, you can jump in there and you can train a skill which you'd otherwise not get the repetition in. Then when you're in the game and you're in that spot, you at least have that technique really like down. That's not a foreign technique anymore. Because what happens is you'll see players where their aim will look awkward or uncomfortable. It's because they haven't developed the technique. It's like when you're sat on the bench and you're like, you have the strength on the bench. We talked about this earlier about like the work capacity versus the CNS. Well, when you have the muscle you have the muscle to hold the weight up there, but your arm is like shaking around. It's like you've got like sudden onset of Parkinson's or something. It's because your central nervous system is like, what do I fire off here? I'm firing everything off to figure it out, and eventually you'll figure it out and you'll stabilize it, and your brain will know how what to fire off, what muscles to use, and you'll be good to go. So it's like a similar kind of situation. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If there's anything else in terms of questions you have around aiming specifically, how to train it, approaches, methodologies, or anything at all, you know what to do. Leave it in the comments below. Send me, a message on Twitter or something, and I would love to hear what you guys want me to talk about. And that way I can help to bring more value to the channels as I start to increase the amount of content that I throw out there. All right, thanks for listening and watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.